How is it that women came to be silenced in the early Christian tradition? The earliest Christian communities, including those established by Paul, were not set up as public institutions like the synagogues or the local trade associations, which met in public buildings and had high social visibility. Paul established house churches, gathering of converts who met in private homes. The significance of this difference should not be overlooked, for in the Roman world, matters of the household were principally handled by women. Of course, even in the home, the husband was lord of the house, with ultimate authority over everything from finances to household religion. But since the home was private space instead of public, most men gave their wives relatively free rein within its confines. If Paul's churches met in private homes, that is, in the world in which women held some degree of jurisdiction, it is small wonder that women often exercised authority in his churches. This was the women's domain. This is perhaps one reason why so many women were drawn to the religion in the first place. Until recently, it was assumed that women were attracted to earliest Christianity because it provided a welcome escape from the misogynist and oppressive social worlds they inhabited, and afforded opportunities to exercise leadership roles previously denied them. Though this assumption was widespread and continues to be adopted by some, it is at odds with the broad range of literary, epigraphical, and artifact evidence which attests that first century CE women, whether Greco-Roman or Jewish, married or widowed, enjoyed a fair amount of autonomy and authority both within and beyond their own households. Some owned and managed businesses, were influential in the public sphere as benefactors and civic patrons, and exercised various leadership roles, including cultic leadership roles. Take, for instance, Lydia, mentioned in Acts 16, who lived in Philippi, an affluent Roman colony, which was geographically well situated for international trade, both via land and sea routes. She not only had a home of her own, but one large enough to accommodate a community of Christ believers, estimated to have numbered around 20 to 25. And she had a household large enough to look after both her property and her affairs. It is also reasonable to imagine that she moved in affluent circles. Given her trade in purple, it is probable that her clients were among the upper crust of Philippian society, perhaps even Roman officials and their entourage. Luke's portrayal of Lydia without mention of her husband or other male authority upon whom she is dependent, able to decide on her own authority to open her home to Paul and his companions, stands apart from normal portrait of first century CE women whose lives were structured by patriarchy. Through marriage, a woman usually passed from under the authority of her oldest male relative to the authority of her husband. However, there existed a few legal provisions that afforded women a certain amount of independence. For example, a woman's marriage could be contracted, resulting in her and her assets remaining under the authority of her father, upon whose death she could inherit property and retain sole possession of it in her own name. The husband acquired no legal authority over his wife or her assets. So even if Lydia was married, she may have benefited from these or other forms of legislation, which would explain why she is presented as operating independently. Her house became the recognized seat of the burdened Christian community in Philippi, over which, as head of the household, she would have exercised leadership. The primacy of her house and therefore her leadership role in the evolution of the church at Philippi becomes clear as one reads to the end of the book of Acts 16. Why then did women's role come to be curtailed? It may be that as the movement grew and individual churches increased in size, more men came to be involved and the activities within the church took on a more public air. People thoroughly imbued with the ancient ideology of gender naturally found it difficult to avoid injecting into the church the perspective that they brought with them when they converted. Women came to be restricted in what they could do in the churches. No longer could they evangelize or teach or exercise authority. These were public activities reserved for the men. The women were to stay at home and protect their modesty, as was natural for them. They were to be submissive in all things to their husbands. They were to bear children and fulfill their functions as the weaker and less perfect members of the human race. The Roman ideology of gender relations became Christianized. Again, if you want to see how the Bible looks at the topic of women from its correct context and historical background, I recommend two books. Matriarchs of the Covenant by Avdil Ben Levi, popularly known as Zion Lex, a masterpiece, a must-have, and my book, Woman by Divine Design. You can find the links to purchase these two books in the description box below.